Before there was the country of Thailand, before the construction of the Grand Palace, Chinatown, or Khao San Road, there was Ayutthaya. From 1351 for 4 centuries, this was, for many, the center of the world. It was Ayutthaya where European traders first built ties with mainland Southeast Asia, the hub of an empire which felled the mighty Khmer, and by the end of the 17th century, it was the largest city on the planet. Ayutthaya would fall to the Burmese in 1767, with the survivors heading south along the Chao Phraya and the old metropolis abandoned. But its ruins still survive, and in the shadows of the ancient capital, the echoes of the past can still be heard. Today, for the first time on this channel, we're taking a trip into the heart of Old Siam, exploring the ruins of the walled city, walking the ancient temples and finding what survives of the food that would become the foundation of modern Thai cuisine. This is Ayutthaya, today on OTR. I'm gonna be honest, I thought Ayutthaya would be farther away. For something so wrapped in the aura of ancient history, it's a little bit surprising that it's pretty much within the suburban sprawl of Bangkok. It's only 80 kilometers away, most of the journey a comfortable drive along the Sirat Expressway. In the old days, this trip, starting from the coast past what's now Bangkok and up to Ayutthaya, was a path well traveled, with anyone who was anyone coming to try to gain favor of the king, to seek fortune, or to build a new home. And while you probably know that there was no YouTube in the Middle Ages, well, if there had been, then I can guarantee we'd be fighting off the ancestors of Mark Wiens and Gary Butler to make this journey, looking for the food of one of the world's first and greatest melting pots. As it is, maybe we're 250 years late to the party, but following a 1-hour drive, at the very least, we're right on time for breakfast. The real fun of being in a place with so much history is that it's not just about the ruins. It's about what might be under your feet. This is a restaurant about 5 minutes driving from the bridge to the so-called island where kings and nobles used to rule their empire. There's no story about this place. It's just a local spot serving things like pad kapow and crispy pork. We honestly weren't even trying to find something historic. That's the nature of a city that was abandoned for 200 years. Every restaurant is relatively new. We literally stopped here because we were hungry and they have food. But just to explain how wild this trip really is, a month ago on the channel we did a story about a Thai snack called Kanam Tokyo, and we happened to mention that there was a Japanese district in old Ayutthaya. Well, that's here. We're literally right on top of it. Just one of the many secrets lost with the fall of the empire. You know, sometimes on the channel it feels like every week we're talking about Ayutthaya, right? Like, every story we're telling about different groups that came to make up what's now Thailand and all the things that have become sort of modern Bangkok, you know, the stories tend to trace back here. This was for a while, there are people who say that this was the biggest city in the entire world, you know, and it was certainly one of the most important cities in Asia. And so to see it in person today, again, I don't know how much we're going to find in the way of authentic history other than the old ruins, because it's the nature of a city that was burned to the ground and moved to the south. But just when we're talking about, like, the Portuguese used to live in this part of Ayutthaya and the Japanese lived here and so on and so forth, you know, we're right there. We're 5 minutes away from some of those old settlements. And so yeah, it's exciting to be here, and today's certainly going to be a good day. And if this food's any indication, we're also going to eat pretty well. All right, before we get any further, let me give a little bit of context to the city of Ayutthaya. The kingdom was founded in 1351 in this spot about 100 kilometers north of the Gulf of Thailand, in a fertile basin perfect for agriculture and defense. It was built on the land of an old Khmer settlement by a man named Utong, who would become known as King Ramatibodi. There are stories that say he was a Siamese prince or a Chinese businessman, that he came from Lopburi or Phetchaburi. Nobody really knows where he came from, but soon enough, the whole Eastern world would know his name. Within 12 months, he'd subjugated the surrounding kingdoms, and he'd even seized the throne of the Khmer Empire. His hold on Angkor wouldn't last, but his army did come home with as many as 100,000 captives, who would set to work digging the canals and working the land, which would help build his new city into a metropolis. Ayutthaya would grow and prosper, the military laying waste to Angkor for good in 1431, while at home, the government established a set of laws so advanced that they would remain in place in Thailand until 1892. The capital would become a powerful trading port, equidistant from China, India, and Malacca. And with prosperity came people. By the year 1690, the home of more than 1 million, the largest city in the entire world. And it would stay that way until it was destroyed. Once the city was abandoned, it would take until the modern era before restoration would begin. By that time, in the years after World War II, Bangkok was booming, and the area around the old seat of power, the island protected by the Chao Phraya, once home to kings feared across the region, was now land occupied by factories and commercial farms. But the hallowed ground itself was almost frozen in time, waiting to be rediscovered. The history of an empire on the other side of the narrow river. It's so interesting, like, you got a modern shopping mall over here. We have like a burger box, and we have an Amazon coffee, and it's September, whatever that is. And then just in between, it's like these old ruins that are massive. You know, it's not like a small part of the city that's the ruins. It's like the city is the ruins, but then you also have this kind of modern tourist infrastructure, these big wide roads. I'm pretty sure that it would take King Narai the Great a while to get his bearings if he came back to Ayutthaya today. The modern city of Ayutthaya is a study in contradictions, a place where the old ruins stand side by side with the new monuments of 21st century civilization, where once decisions were made that affected the lives of countless people. Today the industry is tourism. More than 2 million visitors a year enter the old walled city, with Forbes magazine calling this one of the world's top 50 post-pandemic destinations. And of course, as this is Thailand, nobody goes anywhere without thinking about the food. Because so little is recorded about the everyday cuisine of Ayutthaya, there's been something of a fight led by local vendors to get credit for certain dishes. And one of the most successful, at least when it comes to branding, is the famous Central Thai snack known as boat noodles. Are they actually from here? Probably not. But by now, they're an important part of the city's tourist identity. So to fill up before braving the heat and exploring the ruins, well, we're starting at the boat noodle shop with the biggest crowds.
ร้านนี่เปิดมาประมาณ40 ปีแล้วครับตั้งแต่รุ่นพ่อแล้วก็มาสู่รุ่นลูกครับประมาณ40 ปีผมเป็นรุ่น2จ้ะใครที่มาอยุธยาก็เชิญชวนเที่ยววัดมีวัดหลายที่แล้วก็วัดสวยทุกวัดแหละครับแล้วก็ถ้าหิวก็มาร้านก๋วยเตี๋ยวเรือลุงเล็กได้ครับ
All right, so let me quickly start by explaining where we are, because when you come to Ayutthaya, you have to start with a bowl of boat noodles. I shouldn't say this too loudly, but like we've covered this on the channel before, there is a very passionate
group of people here who say that boat noodles are originally from Ayutthaya. Most likely they're not. From everything that we can sort of dig up, it was actually the Rangsit Canal, which is in between here and Bangkok, where they come from. And that makes sense for a lot of reasons, which is, number one, there's no evidence that these actually existed before the 19th century, which is after Ayutthaya existed. Second, because there really weren't restaurants. You know, if you were walking around Ayutthaya in its heyday, restaurant culture until, 1767 hadn't really been a thing that was established in most of the world, and not here either. That kind of, these snacks to be eaten on the go came a little bit later. But that being said, this is still fascinating because this is Thai Chinese. And, Ayutthaya as a city was really sort of one of the world's first true melting pots. There's a place called Uncle Lex. It's sort of maybe the most famous boat noodle spot in Ayutthaya, and I'm done talking because it's been like 45 minutes since we've eaten anything, and that is just unacceptable.
All right, we're 2 meals deep, but we still haven't found anything that actually traces back to old Ayutthaya. In fact, boat noodles, as they're best known, only date to the 1890s, and the stuff from the first restaurant, pad kapow and crispy pork, both show up in Thailand in the 20th century, which means our mission here is still incomplete. The truth is, finding real history in this city isn't as easy as it might look, given that Ayutthaya was abandoned in the 1760s and what survives is just ruins and whatever was rebuilt in the modern era. So I guess we need to work a little harder to really understand where we are. Not just the broad strokes, but what a day might have actually been like a very long time ago. Now, the Siamese histories of Ayutthaya tell of kings and emperors, wars, and big moments in top-line history. So to really understand the nuances of this old city, it helps to see it through the eyes of a foreigner just like us, who once made this trip into the unknown. And for that, we look to the journals of a man named Fernão Mendes Pinto. Maybe not the most famous of all the Portuguese explorers, but certainly the most eccentric. While his fellow countrymen Ferdinand Magellan and Vasco da Gama would be known for history-changing discoveries, Mendes Pinto was more like a 16th century Forrest Gump, popping up wherever things were happening and somehow ending up in the middle of it. Now, this is a story about Ayutthaya, so I'd strongly suggest you read about this guy on your own time, but the short version is that, at least according to his writing, he was once a bodyguard to the Ethiopian family of Prester John. He fought ocean battles against Suleiman the Magnificent, introduced firearms to Japan, taught the Dalai Lama about the European continent, helped the future St. Francis Xavier build his first Jesuit mission, and worked on the construction of the Great Wall while a prisoner of the Chinese. In fact, being a prisoner was an ongoing theme of his story. According to his own account, he was captured 13 times, sold into slavery 17 times, and shipwrecked so often he personally lost count. Anyway, Mendes Pinto arrived in Ayutthaya around the year 1547, and his experience there would be so impactful that even with all of his other journeys, he'd devote 8 chapters of his book and 7 years of his life to Siam. He writes of arriving in Ayutthaya after a trip up what he describes as a fast-flowing river, finding a gleaming metropolis surrounded by high walls of mud, brick, and adobe. To his estimate, there were 400,000 households in the sprawling city, with a quarter belonging to foreigners, the only place he'd ever seen where it felt like the entire world was represented. According to his writing, he found a place of immense riches, with silk, rubies, sapphires, and ivory all sold in large quantities, and ships leaving every day filled with lumber of the highest quality. He found in abundance honey, sugar, cinnamon, tamarind, and cardamom, with vast quantities of imported silk and cotton coming from China and India. And the taxes, according to Mendes Pinto, were up to the individual merchant, a system of trust where the rich were asked only to pay what they felt was fair, with the money used to build the religious monuments and pagodas Ayutthaya would be famous for. Only the heads of the vassal states were forced to pay duties, following the ancient custom of making an annual trip to the palace to deliver their tribute in person, then kissing the sword at the emperor's side. And perhaps Méndez Pinto today is best remembered as the man who would give Ayutthaya its enduring nickname, the Venice of the East, thanks to the famous network of canals. The city described by Méndez Pinto sounds so unreal that after his account was published, he'd be branded a liar, only to be defended by other Europeans who'd actually been to Ayutthaya, including the head of Siam's Jesuit mission, who wrote that even if many of the stories sounded made up, his accounts of Siam were not just true, but barely even scratched the surface of how remarkable life was inside the old walled city. I don't know, maybe this is more impactful on me than it would be on well, I guess you grew up in America too, but like, coming from a country where like historical sites are from 1936, you know, I still find this fascinating, like all these old, just to your left, wow. The ruins of Ayutthaya range from just before the fall of the kingdom to as far back as the year 1324, a generation before King Wutong even arrived here, when this was an old Khmer fortress. Through the centuries, this piece of land has been sacred ground to the people of multiple cultures and kingdoms, and it was these monuments, like the Statue of Liberty in the New York harbor, that marked the arrival for so many who traveled such long distances to set foot right here. History, even something so important, can be hard to comprehend. I mean, we're surrounded by modern streets and barely out of the city of Bangkok. I guess it's always like that. Today, so many venerated sites, places like Petra, the pyramids, and the Colosseum. Well, you notice in photos it's always facing the same direction because to look the other way would be to ruin the illusion. To remember that these places aren't trips back in time so much as decorations inside modern cities. Even history itself can seem hard to comprehend, even when we're right up close. We don't learn reality, we learn about big moments and big people. Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, King Wutong. But in between the bullet points, there were decades, centuries, when these were just the temples that would have been seen on the horizon by workers selling goods or farmers growing vegetables. It's hard to walk around here and imagine what it might have looked like during the golden age of Ayutthaya, but honestly that's less important than imagining who was actually here, walking around way back then or looking at these structures from a distance. Because honestly these are just piles of bricks and stones. But it's the people who built them, the people who prayed here, walked here, or passed by on their way from all corners of the planet to settle or trade, that made this for a while a place like nowhere else.
You know, it's interesting. It's like, I don't want to overstate, old ruins and temples. And, it's a weird thing about living in this part of the world is you kind of get used to it. But we've talked so much on the channel about the significance of Ayutthaya in the old world. And like, it's just kind of crazy to think about what it must have been like for the first traders or ambassadors or dignitaries who came here to come that long journey up the river and to end up here and surrounded by, like, you can just imagine what this must have looked like, in its glory days. I mean, this is almost 700 years old, 650 years old where we're standing right now. And so, you wind the clock back before this was all burned down, before this was at the center of a whole bunch of wars. And like, this must have been just unbelievably imposing and impressive for people who first came here. It's crazy. Also, I had hoped that driving north would mean that the weather would get cooler, but that's not the case. It turns out driving about 60 kilometers north doesn't make that much of a difference. It is still really hot.
The recorded history of Siamese cuisine begins, of course, in Ayutthaya. This was the city where local ingredients mixed with foreign techniques to create something legendary. It started with the ancient stuff that predates even King Wutong and the founding of the empire. In the beginning, the oldest Siamese cooking techniques were grilling over a fire and making soups, so we can safely assume we'd have found grilled fish and prawns, and given the aromatics native to this region, there were soups like tom yum, or more accurately tom klong, the ancient version making use of dried freshwater fish and tamarind. There were curries, which have been found in central Thailand since at least the 7th century, though they might not have looked much like what you'd think of today. Instead, these were hearty stews of offal and local spices, similar to something like gang ki lek, made with cassia leaves. And thanks to the presence of the ethnic Mon, the group who settled this region even before the Khmer, we know there was a heavy dose of fermented ingredients, fish pastes and pickled vegetables, and almost definitely kanamjin. Actually, we know there was kanamjin because old maps show a canal named in its honor. And of course, there were fish cakes too, which truthfully I have no idea where they came from, except that by the time we reached the beginning of recorded history, they were already everywhere, from the Andaman Sea to the coast of Vietnam. Then we reached the founding of the Ayutthaya Kingdom and the arrival of hundreds of thousands of Chinese. It was here where we first see the introduction to Siam of things like stir-fries and noodle soups. The Portuguese would have a place of honor in Ayutthaya, the only Europeans allowed to settle inside the walled city thanks to the success of their mercenary soldiers hired to fight for Siam. Starting with their arrival in 1511, we see new techniques like baking and, of course, their New World ingredients like chili peppers, papaya, tomatoes, and corn. And it would be Maria Guiomar de Pina, a Portuguese Bengali Japanese woman born in Ayutthaya, who would get credit for introducing the kingdom to an entire category of desserts. As a side note, by the way, the neighborhood where she was born was the Japanese enclave where we started our day, on the land now home to this morning's first restaurant. The Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese, Khmer, and ethnic Mon were most certainly not the only groups to influence the Siamese in Ayutthaya. There were the Persians, who brought their own curries adapted from India during the Mughal Empire. And speaking of India, they were here too, bringing spices and settlers to the Chao Phraya basin. In the city, there were Indonesians, Dutch, French, and Arabs, not to mention those from around the empire, stretching from the old Lanna Kingdom south to Patani on the Malaysian border. Every cluster of migrants and immigrants brought their own foods to Ayutthaya, but they didn't necessarily mix except for within one place, inside the walled city. In the days before commercial kitchens, fusion food was the domain of royalty, and Ayutthaya's palace cuisine is today the stuff of legend. It was there that we truly see the birth of modern Thai food, the flavors of the melting pot which would one day make Thailand a culinary destination like few others on Earth. Today here in Ayutthaya, there is a signature dish most associated with this historic city. In the true fashion of the empire's golden age, it's something that represents fusion, the mixing and blending of cultures to create something made here before anywhere else. But it's not something of royal background, an iconic specialty like masaman curry or the famous cow che. In the ancient home of King Utong, the seat of the Old Kingdom and one of history's greatest melting pots, it's, of all things, a cotton candy burrito. Let me introduce you to Roti Sai Mai, a pandan-flavored pancake wrapped around thin strands of pulled sugar. The single must-have dish served in Ayutthaya today, something sold all across the Old Town, along the highway heading back to Bangkok, and especially at this one alley, a road named after the founder of the empire, King Utong himself, which, if he returned from the dead, might be more of a shock than seeing the ruins themselves. The story of Roti Sai Mai in almost every source, including the Michelin Guide and Thailand's tourism website, is that this was an ancient treat brought to the old city by Muslims from the south. Well, no. It was invented in 1963. Created by a 17-year-old, a kid named Salem Sangaroon. He came up with it by mistake after burning some caramel meant for his uncle's sweet roti cart and playing with it like only a teenager might think to do. His accidental creation would catch on. His 10 brothers and sisters would join him in setting up businesses, and before long, well, this is what happened. It has a flavor described as pure sugar and a texture often compared to biting into fiberglass. Don't ask me why, but I kind of love it.
สวัสดีค่ะอันนี้ร้านโรตีปวีวรรณนะคะหรือชื่ออีกอย่างร้านโรตีต่อแถวเราตั้งมาที่นี่ประมาณ20ปีนะคะเป็นร้านดั้งเดิมเก่าแก่ค่ะทำไมคนถึงชอบกินโรตีสายไหมถนนเส้นนี้เขาเรียกว่าเส้นโรตีสายไหมนะคะนักท่องเที่ยวหรือคนต่างชาติแล้วก็คนไทยก็จะชอบเพราะว่ามันเป็นอาหารหวานที่ทานง่ายๆแป้งก็จะมีหลายรสชาติแต่ละร้านจะมีเอกลักษณ์ไม่เหมือนกันส่วนเส้นโรตีเนี่ยจะเป็นเส้นโรตีชนิดพิเศษนะคะมันไม่ได้มีแต่น้ำตาลแต่จะมีส่วนผสมของแป้งแล้วก็อย่างอื่นด้วยแล้วก็เป็นอาหารที่ทานได้ง่ายซื้อเป็นของฝากก็ได้ค่ะเพราะฉะนั้นใครมาที่นี่ต้องมาอยุธยาต้องมาทานโรตีสายไหมจึงจะถึงอยุธยานะคะ
All right, as unique and fascinating as Ayutthaya's old city is, even though we've barely scratched the surface of the old ruins, we are at the end of the day a food history channel, and with all respect to the places we've been, we did come here for a reason, and we can't complete our trip back in time with meals of pad kapow, boat noodles, and fiberglass made from sugar. As it turns out, there is one way for us to find some actual living history, to taste the flavors that once defined a long-lost empire. But to get there, well, it means leaving the old city and taking a short drive into the countryside to find where the people settled after the city was destroyed. And while we're on the way, if you'll indulge me one last bit of history, we need to talk about what happened in 1767 that burned it all to the ground. The story of the fall of Ayutthaya would begin 200 years before the decisive battle, far to the west in a strategic trading port in today's Myanmar called Dawei. Now, Dawei had been a tributary of Siam's Sukhothai Empire in its control passed to Ayutthaya. But its land was claimed by the Taungoo, the ascendant Burmese kingdom that in 1547 was expanding to Siam's northwest. Now, at the time, Ayutthaya was in a royal crisis, which I won't get into because it would take more seasons than Game of Thrones, but the point is the Burmese saw weakness and decided to attack. The Siamese had garrisoned Dawei with around 6,000 troops, and the Burmese sent in twice that number, won control of the city, and then decided they'd be better off without their powerful rival at all. So they rode on Ayutthaya, where they were defeated and turned away. But by now, the die was cast. Within 7 years, the Burmese had taken control of Siam's north, ruling from Chiang Mai. And in 1564, they took their shot, marching from the north and this time capturing the Siamese capital. It was actually the Burmese in control of Ayutthaya for a period of 25 years before the Siamese forced them out. And then Siam immediately attacked west again, setting their sights once more on Dawei. The cycle of mutual invasions would continue almost nonstop for the next 200 years, with the final battle officially counted as the 11th Burma-Ayutthaya War. That last war would again start with a fight over Dawei. Honestly, the circumstances were almost the exact same as the first time. Siam once again was in control of the port city, and there was even a new Burmese kingdom seeking expansion, this time the Konbaung dynasty. Except there were two major differences. First, Ayutthaya in the 18th century had fallen into constant chaos, with internal battles for the throne and a growing list of external feuds, all papered over only by the fact that the city had become very, very rich. That was because of the rice trade with China, which started in 1727 and made almost everyone, from the farmers to the traders to the shippers, extraordinarily wealthy. And wealthy people don't like sending their kids to the army, so the old conscription system failed, and within 4 decades the capital was practically undefended. And the second difference was this time the Burmese had the benefit of 200 years of preparation. So when they came from everywhere. They invaded from the west and the north, and in 1766, they even sent 100,000 troops to subjugate Lao, taking over the kingdom to Siam's east. they had Ayutthaya surrounded. And in 1767, well, that was that. Over the next 2 centuries, Ayutthaya would become Thonburi, which would give way to Ratanakosin. The kingdom would advance from jungles to factories, canals to highways. Siam would become Thailand, and the old empire was just something from long ago. The architectural project to uncover the ruins of Ayutthaya wouldn't begin until 1956, then would be put on hold for a dozen years because of political turmoil. Tourists wouldn't even begin coming until the 1970s, and the whole idea of this as a popular getaway is very, very new. The story of the fall of Ayutthaya is well told, but there is one flaw in the famous narrative, which is that every single survivor, everyone in what was once the world's biggest city, had simply gotten on boats and resettled. The truth is, people are stubborn. Some stuck around. The ones who stayed worked the farmland or lived in small villages along the water. But as Bangkok grew and this location became important again, a few of those villages became towns. This is Sena, which began to grow around the 1920s when arrivals from the new capital joined the fishermen and rice farmers whose families had never left. Here we can find something that in the walled city is long lost, if it ever even existed. The food of old central Thailand. The meals that haven't really changed since King Utong first built his palace.
Well, actually, this restaurant has opened for three generations. The first generation would be my grandfather, and the next generation, second, is my grandfather, and the last generation for third generation is my dad, who had earned the Asian Guide for 3 years.
Three years ago, this restaurant, Opochana, became one of the first places recognized by Michelin when they expanded into Ayutthaya. Our host's great-grandfather moved here from China in the 1930s, just as the Chinese were introducing restaurant culture to Thailand. Here, in a small fishing village, food was eaten at home, but Mr. O learned the traditional local recipes and set up a shop. 75 years later, it's still here, serving the exact same dishes in the exact same way.
So this menu is called grilled river prawn. It will be 3 prawns per 1 kilogram here, served with the seafood sauce here. And this one is tom klong with broker man clocker. Yes, with the broker man clocker will be fried before doing tom klong. And this one is actually sushi with Bushman croaker too. This one we have complete in Iron Chef Thailand too. And this one is a fish cake or fish donuts here.
First time in a long time that I've tried what has always sort of been the signature dish of the Chao Phraya River. Let's get in here. If you can see this, the shrimp butter just kind of melting over top of everything. This comes up just like a lobster. That's just half of one river prawn. And it's not seasoned, it's just grilled. The flavor is just the prawn itself. If you blindfolded me and you asked me what I was eating, I would say this is lobster.
The food on this table represents history. There's Chuchi curry, created in the days of Imperial Ayutthaya, mixing a southern spice blend with local river fish. There are prawns from the Chao Phraya, famous around the world for their size and quality. Fish cakes eaten throughout Southeast Asia for more than 1,000 years. And tom klong, the soup that predates tom yum, which is a dish we once covered as being the very best representation of the earliest known Siamese cuisine.
Tom Klong. This is gonna be, it's gonna be warm. This was on fire 10 seconds ago. All right, let's just give this one try and then get on with it. There's like, it's the taste of history.
Today, there are 14 restaurants listed in the Michelin Guide in Ayutthaya to have earned a Bib Gourmand. That number, by the way, includes both Uncle Lek's boat noodles as well as the first place on earth to make the guide selling Roti Sai Mai. But of the rest, most are part of a growing list of venues like Opo Chana, which specialize in making the real original stuff, the food that tells the story of this incredible place. Visiting the old city today might not feel quite like a trip back in time. Just like so much of Greater Bangkok, it's busy and hectic and a little bit weird. But maybe that energy, the busy streets and the tuk-tuks and the guys playing street guitar, maybe that's as honest a tribute as any to the legacy of Ayutthaya. The melting pot that might have moved on, but still exists in a country that now stands peacefully without threat of invasion. A city that once housed 50,000 war elephants now puts tourists on their backs to ride to see the old ruins, and the temples once meant only for the elite are now accessible to everyone. The people who built the old empire are now part of the modern Bangkok to the south, except the few who stuck around and kept us from forgetting old traditions. I wonder what a time traveler from old Ayutthaya, who in their time would have witnessed so much bloodshed but also innovation, who experienced their lives in a way we can't even comprehend, might think about this place if they could see it today. How they'd feel if they saw their city reduced to a pile of rocks, sitting in the shadow of a new city that's 15 times larger than Ayutthaya at its peak. And I wonder if they'd realize how much of an impact they had on the world we now live in. Today in Thailand, we obviously have things a lot better than they were during the Ayutthaya period. Society and technology have come a long way, and there really weren't any breaks, even in the Golden Age, from the constant threat of war and invasion. But at least the people who lived under the empire have one thing on all of us, which is that they never had to deal with the traffic on the Sirat Expressway at 5:30 in the afternoon. At least Dan's car had air conditioning, something else unique to our modern world, and we'd stocked up on enough Roti Sai Mai to live on for as long as we needed. We might not have found any restaurants dating back to the 14th century, but we ate well and had a good time, and really, that's a gift we can credit to Ayutthaya, the empire that laid the groundwork for the place we now call home. Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to those who support us on Patreon. It helps to keep us going. Find links below for our Patreon and social media, and we'll see you next week.